Welcome back to Midsummer Myths, the place where real power, injustice, and revenge collide in stories that leave you questioning just how far people can go when they're pushed too far. Today's story: a black CEO who was humiliated on a flight only to pull $5 billion out from under the airline that dared to disrespect her. Sit tight, because this one isn't just about money. It's about pride, dignity, the kind of revenge only someone at the very top could deliver. Her name was Dr. Alanna Pierce, and anyone who really knew her understood one thing: she didn't just build companies, she built empires. By the time she was 45, she had turned a series of small acquisitions into a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund that backed tech startups, green energy projects, and even entire aerospace ventures. To the outside world, she was the definition of polished excellence. To those who underestimated her, she was the storm they never saw coming. But that morning, Lana wasn't walking into a boardroom or addressing shareholders. She was standing in line at gate C-23 at Denver International Airport, dressed simply in a tailored navy suit with a slim leather briefcase at her side. She wasn't even flying private today, a rarity for her. But the truth was, she'd wanted something simple, something normal. She was headed to a quiet leadership retreat in Vancouver, where executives put away their titles and stripped things down to human connection. At least, that was the plan. Alanna's assistant had double-checked the flight, coconed first-class seating, and even made sure her preferred vegan meal was arranged. Everything was lined up, but sometimes it's not the systems that fail, it's the people running them. When the boarding call came, Alanna stepped forward with her ticket, gave a polite nod to the gate agent, and walked the short jet bridge with the unassuming confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. But even as she approached her seat, she caught the side glances. A few passengers stiffened when she moved down the aisle, some staring a moment too long, as if her presence in first class was a mistake. She was used to it. She'd been black, female, and successful for long enough to know how invisible ceilings, invisible suspicion worked. Still, Alanna brushed it off, sliding into 2A, stowing her briefcase neatly. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. She pulled out her tablet and began reviewing notes for an upcoming acquisition deal that could reshape the biotech industry. Her mind was already shifting gears when she noticed two uniformed airline security officers step onto the plane. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations hushed, eyes followed. The officers scanned the rows, and then one pointed directly toward her. "Ma'am," the taller one said, his voice clipped, "we're going to need you to come with us." Alanna blinked, lowering her tablet. "Excuse me? Please gather your belongings and step off the plane," he repeated, this time louder, as though he wanted everyone to hear. Passengers craned their necks. Someone whispered, "What did?" "She'll do." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Alanna kept her voice calm, even as heat rose in her chest. "I think there must be some mistake. This is my assigned seat." "Huh?" She showed her ticket, her name clearly printed. The officer barely glanced at it. "We've had a report about your boarding. We'll need to sort this out off the aircraft." Report. The word hung in the air like a weapon. No details, no explanations, just a vague justification. Alanna could feel every eye in the cabin burning into her. She knew what they saw: a tall, black woman, confident, unflinching, refusing to shrink under the accusation. To some, that alone was reason enough to think she didn't belong. Reluctantly, she gathered her briefcase, stood, and followed the officers back down the aisle. The murmurs grew louder. A man in 3C muttered, "Figures." Another passenger shook his head with quiet disgust, as if her very presence had tainted the flight. The walk of shame stretched longer than it should have. By the time Alanna stepped back into the terminal, her heart hammered not from fear, but from fury. They didn't take her to a private office, or offer even the courtesy of discretion. Instead, they stopped just beyond the gate, in full view of other waiting passengers. The gate agent, the same one who had smiled as she scanned Alana's ticket minutes earlier, now avoided her eyes. "Ma'am," one officer said, folding his arms, "we received a concern that your boarding pass might not match your identity." Alana almost laughed. "Are you serious? You've seen my ID? You've scanned my ticket. Everything matched. What exactly is the issue here?" The officer's tone hardened. "I'm asking the questions. Where did you get this ticket?" Her nostrils flared. "From the airline. Purchased legitimately under my name, Dr. Alana Pierce. Do you need to see my passport again?" They hesitated, exchanging a glance. Something about her composure unsettled them, but pride wouldn't let them admit a mistake. Finally, after several tense minutes, they waved her off with a dismissive, "You can reboard," but the damage was done. Okay. The passengers in the terminal had seen her pulled aside like a criminal. The passengers already on the plane had seen her marched out like a fraud. And Alana Pierce, who controlled more capital than most countries, had just been treated like she didn't belong in a seat she had paid for, because someone decided she didn't look the part as she walked back down the jet bridge, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor. Something inside her shifted. She slid back into her seat, ignoring the stares, her face an unreadable mask. But beneath it all, a quiet, razor-sharp promise formed. They thought they'd humiliated her. They had no idea what they had just set in motion, because Alana Pierce didn't get even. She got ahead. And this time, getting ahead meant making the entire airline feel the cost of their arrogance down to the very last dollar. Asterisk. The plane took off 30 minutes later, but for Alana, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with a silence that clung to her every move. The passengers around her avoided eye contact, their whispers having already spread through the cabin like wildfire. Even those who knew she'd been allowed back on weren't looking at her with sympathy. They looked at her as if she had slipped through the cracks, as if she was a problem the airline had failed to remove. She kept her posture straight, her breathing even, her gaze steady out the oval window. Years of navigating boardrooms filled with doubt and prejudice had trained her well, but no amount of corporate armor could completely shield her from the sting of being treated like a trespasser in a space she had more than earned. The flight attendant returned with a nervous smile, offering a glass of sparkling water. "Dr. Pierce, your meal will be served shortly. Please, let us know if there's anything we can do." The tone was polite, but not apologetic. It wasn't contrition, it was containment. Okay, the airline wasn't sorry for what had happened. They just wanted her quiet, compliant, uncomplaining until they reached Vancouver. Alana thanked her with a faint nod, but inside her mind, calculations were already being made. Not emotional ones, strategic. She thought of the investors she was scheduled to meet that week. One in particular stood out, an institutional pension fund that controlled several billion in airline investments, the same pension fund she'd been courting for months, preparing to direct into her firm's newest aerospace initiative. Now, the timing felt poetic. By the time the plane touched down, Alana had already outlined her next steps, not in fiery outrage, but in precise, surgical revenge. Still, fate wasn't done pressing its hand as passengers disembarked. A man in an expensive suit, maybe late 50s, silver hair slicked back, paused near her row, leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice just enough to be heard. "Rough day, huh? Don't take it personally. First class isn't what it used to be. They've got to keep it exclusive, you know?" The words dripped with condescension, the kind that carried more weight than any outright insult. He was smiling as he said it, as if offering solidarity, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He believed she didn't belong, and the officers had only been doing what he quietly approved of. Alana let her lips curve into the faintest smile. "You're right," she said softly. "First class isn't what it used to be. Intend to fix that." The man gave a short laugh, misinterpreting her meaning, before grabbing his briefcase and walking off. Outside the terminal, Lana's driver was already waiting with the sleek black sedan she preferred on trips like this. As she slid into the back seat, the privacy glass closing behind her, she finally allowed herself to exhale. Her assistant, Mara, was already on the phone, her voice sharp as she recounted the incident in rapid detail. "They pulled you off the plane in front of everyone. Dr. Pierce, this is unacceptable. Should I call legal? Should I go public?" Lana raised a hand, calm and deliberate. "Not yet. The loudest noise isn't always the most effective. Tony want headlines. I want leverage. Reach out to Peterson and Klein. Tell them, want a breakfast meeting tomorrow. Discreet, and make sure they know it's urgent." Mara's eyes widened. Peterson and Klein were the lead advisors for the pension fund. That meeting had been tentatively scheduled for months, carefully maneuvered into place. Moving it up was bold, risky, even, but Alana wasn't one to wait. When momentum presented itself, the car wound through Vancouver's streets, the city lights flickering against the tinted windows. Alana sat in silence, scrolling through her tablet, reviewing figures she already knew by heart. Billions in investments, billions in influence, and all it took to unleash it was a trigger. And today, the airline had given her one dot. By the next morning, word of the incident had already begun trickling through back channels. Someone on the flight had posted about the mystery passenger pulled off and then let back on. Another passenger tweeted a blurry photo of her walking down the jet bridge, framing it as a potential security scare. The narrative was forming without her, but Alana didn't panic. Let them talk. The more the story spread in whispers, the more potent her silence would be when she finally moved at breakfast. Peterson and Klein leaned in across the polished mahogany table of the private club where Alana always preferred to meet. They were seasoned men, both in their early 60s, both accustomed to controlling massive sums with quiet, careful hands. "You sounded urgent, Dr. Pierce," Peterson said, lowering his voice. "What's happened?" Alana didn't hesitate. "Your fund currently holds just under $5 billion in airline equity across 3 carriers, correct?" They exchanged a glance. "That's right." She placed her phone on the table. Screen lit with a paused video clip, one of the many circulating online of her being escorted off the plane. "This is how one of those carriers treats their highest paying customers. This is how they treat me." Their faces shifted, a mix of shock and discomfort. Lana continued, her tone measured, precise. "You are about to decide where to allocate $5 billion over the next fiscal year. I suggest you reconsider whether companies that treat their clientele like criminals deserve that capital. My firm has an aerospace initiative ready to absorb it, one designed to outpace carriers that can't evolve beyond prejudice." The room fell silent. Peterson cleared his throat. "Dr. Pierce, okay, are you saying you want us to divest?" Her eyes locked onto his. "I'm saying I want justice, okay? And sometimes justice is written in numbers. You asked me months ago why I cared about building an aerospace venture when I already had so many industries under my belt. This is why. Because sometimes the only way to correct the system is to become the system." Klein leaned back, exhaling. Slowly, you realize the ripple this would cause. "Yes," Alana said. "I realize it perfectly." And in that moment, the humiliation she had endured in front of strangers transformed into something far more dangerous. The airline thought they had reduced her to a spectacle, an inconvenience to be shuffled off quietly. Instead, they had placed themselves directly in the crosshairs of someone who had both the resources and the resolve to dismantle them piece by piece. The escalation had begun, not with shouting, not with lawsuits, not with viral outrage, but with a calm, calculated breakfast meeting that would change the trajectory of an entire industry. And Alanna Pearce had no intention of stopping there. When Alanna left that breakfast meeting, she didn't walk out with rage simmering in her chest. She walked out with clarity. It's a kind of clarity only someone at her level could wield. The certainty that she had the resources to turn humiliation into demolition. The world didn't know it yet, but the fuse had already been lit. By that afternoon, the pension fund advisors had already convened a confidential meeting. Billions in airline equity were now under review, and though no names were mentioned publicly, the carriers in question were the same ones who had enjoyed unchecked loyalty from institutional investors for years. For the first time in a decade, cracks appeared in their armor. Meanwhile, the airline itself remained blissfully unaware of the storm forming above its head. In their world, the incident was just another security check, gone slightly too far. They filed it under protocol, convinced the woman they'd pulled off their plane would disappear into the noise of corporate travel. What they hadn't factored in was who she actually was, inside her hotel suite overlooking Vancouver's harbor. Alanna sat cross-legged on the leather sofa, her tablet propped against a stack of reports. Her assistant, Mara, sat opposite her, typing furiously. "We've already had 2 calls from journalists," Mara said, pausing only to sip from her coffee. "Someone leaked the video to a local news station. They want a comment from you." Alanna shook her head. "No statements, no interviews. Let the silence build pressure. If they don't hear from me, they'll speculate. If they speculate, the narrative fractures. That's when we control the pieces." Mara frowned. "So we just let it spread?" Alanna's eyes were cold and deliberate. "Exactly. Scandal without a face loses oxygen. I don't need to be the victim here. I need to be the storm they didn't see coming." She tapped the tablet screen, pulling up a spreadsheet filled with cascading numbers. "Here's what you will do. I want every analyst on our payroll, running projections on divestment scenarios. Show what happens when $5 billion in equity is pulled from major carriers. Show how their competitors gain. And most importantly, show how our aerospace initiative absorbs the fallout." Mara's fingers flew across the keyboard, already drafting the instructions. That night, while most executives slept soundly believing the world would continue as it always had, Alanna's team quietly seeded whispers in financial circles. Reports began surfacing of unconfirmed divestment talks. The kind of leaks that traders pounce on before facts are verified. Stock tickers wavered, analysts raised eyebrows, and inside boardrooms, nervous glances were exchanged. By the end of the week, the airline that had pulled her from her seat saw its market cap shave off nearly 2% in a single day. Small enough to be dismissed as volatility, large enough to spark questions. And then came the call. "Dr. Pearce." The voice on the other end was smooth but strained, carrying the forced politeness of a man in damage control. "This is Richard Holloway, Chief Operating Officer of North Sky Airlines. I understand there was unfortunate misunderstanding on your recent flight." Alanna's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "A misunderstanding? Is that what we're calling it?" Holloway cleared his throat. "I assure you, this does not reflect the values of our airline. Security was simply following standard procedures. We would like to extend our sincerest apologies, as well as a complimentary travel package for your inconvenience." She cut him off, her tone cool as steel. "Mr. Holloway, do you know who I am?" The pause on the line was telling. A T head. A file, of course. Someone in his office had pulled her name, her title, her affiliations. But the hesitation betrayed the truth. He didn't really know. "Not yet. I know you are a valued customer," he said carefully. "No," Alanna said, her voice sharp enough to slice through his pretense. "I am the managing partner of Pearce Equity Group. I oversee a fund worth $32 billion, with investors that include the very institutions propping up your airline. Yesterday, two of those investors sat across from me and asked whether their capital was being managed responsibly. And do you know what I showed them, Mr. Holloway? I showed them a video of your security pulling me off a plane like I was a criminal. The silence on the other end stretched long and uneasy. So tell me, Alana continued softly, do you still think this is about a complimentary travel package? Holloway stammered, trying to recover. Dr. Pierce, I think we can resolve this without any drastic measures. Surely we can come to an understanding. Alana leaned back against the sofa, her gaze fixed on the city lights glittering outside. Oh, I fully intend for us to come to an understanding. The only question is whether it will be before or after $5 billion leaves your books. Line went dead quiet. For the first time, the airline understood the gravity of their mistake. Over the next few days, the retaliation unfolded, not as a public spectacle, but as a private earthquake. Investors whispered of divestments. Competitors sensed blood in the water and sharpened their strategies. And through it all, Alana remained silent, untouchable, her name floating in the background like a storm cloud waiting to break. Meanwhile, employees within the airline started to feel the tremors. Mid-level managers received memos about customer sensitivity training, hastily arranged to appease what they thought was a small PR issue. Executives scrambled to identify which flight crew had been on duty, who had filed the report, and whether anyone had leaked details. But none of that mattered anymore. The problem wasn't a single employee or a single incident. The problem was that their arrogance had collided headfirst with someone who had the power to redefine their future. And in the quiet corners of her office, Lana was already drafting the terms of that future. Not as an apology, not as restitution, but as proof that humiliation, when inflicted on the wrong person, could become the most expensive mistake an airline had ever made. The retaliation had begun and it was only going to get louder. The following week, financial news outlets were buzzing with speculation. Nothing official had been announced, but the whispers were getting louder. A massive pension fund was preparing to pull billions from the airline sector. Investors were jittery, analysts cautious, and airline executives on edge. Inside North Sky Airlines headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from confidence to crisis. Daily meetings stretched long into the night, filled with nervous chatter and half-baked PR strategies. Richard Holloway, the coup who had spoken to Alana on the phone, was now pacing boardroom floors like a man watching his own house catch fire. Who is this woman really? One executive snapped during a tense meeting. She can't just wave her hand and tank our stock. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand. Holloway rubbed his temples, exhausted. She's not just some woman. She controls capital, real capital. And right now, she's making us look like amateurs in front of the very investors we rely on. At the head of the table, the CEO, a man whose career had been built on charm and quarterly reports, spoke up. Then we make a deal. We offer her stock options, a seat on an advisory board, whatever it takes to make this go away quietly. What none of them realized was that Alana had no interest in deals, no patience for olive branches wrapped in empty gestures. She hadn't orchestrated this for perks or recognition. She wanted the airline to feel what it meant to disregard someone who held the keys to their future. And that moment came on a gray Thursday morning. Peterson and Klein, a pension fund advisors, issued a discreet but firm notice. $5 billion in equity would be pulled from North Sky Airlines and redistributed to competitors in new aerospace ventures. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but in the financial world, it landed like a thunderclap. The airline stock plummeted within hours, shaving nearly 10% off its value in a single trading day. Analysts on live television scrambled to explain the sudden shift, speculating about investor confidence in emerging markets. but insiders knew the truth. One woman had tilted the scales, and an entire corporation was paying the price. In her office overlooking the Vancouver skyline, Alana watched the tickers fall in real time. The red numbers cascading across the screen weren't just statistics, they were a form of poetry. Every dip, every percentage lost, was a reminder that power wasn't always loud or visible. Sometimes, power was the quiet hand that pulled the D strings unseen until the curtain fell. Mara burst into the room, practically glowing with adrenaline. Dr. Pierce, it's everywhere. CNBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, they're all covering the divestment. Kai is down nearly 12%. The CEO's been forced to call an emergency press conference. Alana didn't flinch, didn't even smile. She simply closed her tablet, folded her hands neatly on the desk, and said, "Good. Now the lesson begins." That afternoon, as North Sky executives stood behind the podium delivering carefully rehearsed apologies about market conditions and long-term strategies, reporters fired questions they weren't prepared to answer. Is it true the divestment was triggered by a passenger incident? Are you losing institutional confidence? What steps are you taking to rebuild trust with your highest-paying customers? The CEO dodged. Holloway deflected, but the damage was already done. Their stock wasn't just falling, it was bleeding. Meanwhile, Alana received a call she had been expecting. Dr. Pierce. Peterson's voice came through, steady but tinged with awe. "I don't know what you did, but I've never seen an airline this shaken. They're scrambling. You've got their full attention." "That's not what I want," Alana replied calmly. "Attention is temporary. What I want is change. Real, structural change." The following day, North Sky sent a delegation 3 senior executives, including Holloway himself, to meet with her privately. They arrived at her office with nervous smiles, carrying binders filled with proposed settlements, stock offers, advisory positions, charitable donations. They threw everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. Alana listened politely, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Gentlemen, you seem to misunderstand. This isn't about me. This is about accountability." One of them shifted uncomfortably. "Then tell us what you want." Alana let the silence hang, savoring their unease before she spoke. "I want 3 things. First, I want a public apology, not buried in fine print, not slipped into a press release, but a full acknowledgement that what happened on that flight was wrong. Second, I want systemic change, mandatory bias training, quail oversight, and accountability for the people who think customers can be profiled and humiliated without consequence. And third, Quaid." She paused, her eyes locking onto theirs like a predator closing in. "I want you to understand that this is the cost of arrogance. $5 billion today, and if nothing changes, more tomorrow." The room went dead quiet. Holloway's jaw tightened, but he knew there was no fighting it. They had already lost too much. When the meeting ended, the executives left pale and shaken, their binders untouched. Alana remained seated, her gaze fixed on the skyline. She hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't threatened or raged. She hadn't needed to. The results spoke for themselves. By the end of the month, North Sky Airlines was in freefall. Stock value down nearly 20%. Board members facing shareholder lawsuits. Internal memos leaked, exposing chaos and finger-pointing at every level. And above it all, the image of Alana Pierscombe, unyielding, untouchable, loomed over their collapse like a shadow they couldn't escape. She hadn't just pulled $5 billion in funding. She had pulled the rug out from under their entire illusion of control. And in the quiet moments when she allowed herself a sip of wine by her hotel window, Lana thought back to the moment it had all begun, the humiliating walk down that jet bridge, the whispers of strangers, the sting of being told she didn't belong. Now the whole world knew exactly how wrong they had been, and she was only just beginning. The ripple effect of Elena Carter's decision to pull $5 billion in funding did not end with the collapse of Sky Atlantic Airlines. In fact, that was only the opening tremor of an earthquake that reshaped the aviation industry. When the press broke the story of what had happened on that flight, that a black woman CEO had been pulled off an airplane by security for no reason other than racial profiling, the internet exploded. Hashtags flooded Twitter. Talk shows dissected the story, questioning how an airline in 2025 could still be caught up in such a blatant display of prejudice. And it wasn't just the humiliation of being removed, it was the financial consequence. Suddenly, Sky Atlantic went from being a titan to a cautionary tale, all because one executive had mistaken power for privilege and forgotten who really sat on the throne. Inside corporate boardrooms across the country, the story became a whispered warning. Don't let a Carter situation happen here. Policy revisions came fast. Airlines scrambled to update training programs, to add diversity consultants, to issue carefully worded statements of solidarity. But the truth was clear. The reckoning wasn't about policies. It was about perception. And once the public saw Sky Atlantic for what it was, there was no recovering. For Elena, though, the fallout was deeply personal. She received letters, thousands of them, some from ordinary travelers thanking her for standing up to the system, others from young black women who said they finally saw someone who looked like them refusing to be silenced. Parents wrote to her about their daughters, saying Elena's act of retaliation gave them hope that the world could change. And yet, Elena never gloated. When a journalist asked her if she felt proud for bringing down Sky Atlantic, she answered with that same calm, sharp tone she'd used in the boardroom. I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves the moment they decided someone's skin tone was worth more than their seat. What happened to the CEO of Sky Atlantic, Robert Langley? His downfall was as public as it was humiliating. He was fired by the board he once commanded, stripped of his golden parachute, and facing lawsuits from investors who claimed he had failed his fiduciary duty by mishandling a crisis. Langley found himself isolated. News cameras followed him as he walked into courtrooms, his polished image now reduced to a bitter man clinging to excuses. It was a misunderstanding, he told reporters, but the public wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, Elena had choices. Other airlines rushed to court her company, desperate to fill the gap left by Sky Atlantic's collapse. Delta, United, Emirates, they all extended offers. But Elena, true to form, took her time. She studied the proposals carefully, met with executives quietly, and reminded them all, this is not just about planes. This is about respect, okay? In the end, she signed an exclusive 10-year partnership with a rival airline, one that offered better terms, more control, and a clear commitment to diversity and fairness. The deal was worth even more than what Sky Atlantic had lost. And just like that, Elena transformed her act of revenge into a blueprint for power. Still, the most poetic piece of irony came months later. Elena was scheduled to speak at a major international business summit in Zurich. She boarded a plane in New York first class, of course, and settled into her seat. The flight attendant, recognizing her, leaned down and whispered, "Ma'am, I just want to say thank you. Because of you, our training changed. We see things differently now." Elena simply smiled, her quiet acknowledgement saying more than words ever could. When the wheels lifted off the runway, she closed her eyes and thought about that night on Sky Atlantic, the cold stares, the security officer's hand gripping her arm. And then she thought about what followed the collapse of a corporation, the rise of a new standard, the empowerment of thousands who now looked at her and saw possibility. Injustice had tried to humiliate her. Instead, it had handed her the most powerful weapon of all, the chance to rewrite the rules. And that is the essence of this story, how arrogance in a single moment can cost billions. How a company's refusal to see a woman's worth can become its downfall, and how true justice sometimes doesn't come from a courtroom, but from the unflinching decisions of those who refuse to be underestimated. Because the truth is, Sky Atlantic didn't just lose money, it lost history. Its name, once spoken with pride, was now a punchline. And Alina Carter, she became more than a CEO. She became a myth, a living reminder that those who wield power carelessly may one day find themselves begging mercy from the very hands they once disrespected.